The scent of stale coffee and photocopier toner was the perfume of Amelia's life. For 5 years, she had been the silent engine in the executive suite of Sterling Corp, the administrative assistant to the notoriously arrogant vice president, Mr. Harrison. She was the keeper of his schedule, the buffer for his angry calls, and, more often than not, the ghostwriter of his most successful proposals. Amelia was meticulous, efficient, and invisible, a role she had accepted with a quiet resignation, believing that hard work would eventually speak for itself. It never did. The quarterly report was Mr. Harrison's Everest, a mountain he claimed to conquer every 3 months, but whose treacherous slopes were, in reality, navigated entirely by Amelia. This time, however, was different. The company was on the brink of a major merger, and this report wasn't just a summary of past performance. It was the blueprint for the future, a document that would be scrutinized by the entire board of directors. The pressure was immense. For 2 weeks, Amelia had worked tirelessly. She'd stayed late, her dinner a sad desk-side sandwich, and arrived early, greeting the dawn with spreadsheets and market analysis. She had pored over every number, cross-referenced every source, and woven the complex data into a clear, compelling narrative. The report was her masterpiece, a testament to her skill and dedication. The final draft, bound in a crisp blue folder, sat on her desk, a beacon of her unsung effort. She found Mr. Harrison staring out his corner office window, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips as he watched the city bustle below. He turned as she entered, his eyes skimming over her with the same casual indifference he gave the office furniture. "Ah, Amelia, you have the report?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescending smoothness. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," she said, placing it on his polished mahogany desk. "It's all there. I've double-checked the projections and added a new section on risk analysis, just as you requested in passing last week." He didn't even glance at it. Instead, he picked up a silver pen, tapping it rhythmically against the desk. "Risk analysis? How ambitious of you. I'm sure it's adequate." A knot of frustration tightened in Amelia's stomach. "Sir, if you have a moment, I'd like to walk you through the key findings. The data from the third quarter is particularly complex, and I think it's crucial you understand the nuances before the board meeting." Mr. Harrison finally looked at her, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. He chuckled, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the silent office. "Amelia, my dear Amelia, your job is to make things look neat, to bind the pages and make the coffee. You're not paid to think." He gestured vaguely toward her. "Let's be honest. Your primary role here is to be decorative. You brighten up the place." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Decorative. After all the nights, the skipped lunches, the intellectual energy she had poured into his career, that was all she was to him. A piece of office decor. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She saw her 5 years of dedication flash before her eyes, not as a ladder she was climbing, but as a cage she had willingly built around herself. He smirked again, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. "Now, run along. I need to prepare for my presentation. I'll look over your little notes later." Amelia stood frozen for a second, her heart pounding in her ears. The anger was so potent, so pure, it burned away the years of quiet compliance. A sudden, dangerous clarity washed over her. She looked at the blue folder on his desk, her work, her intellect, her soul, bound and ready to be claimed by him. Then she looked at the second, identical folder on her own desk just outside his door. This one contained the original draft, the one from a week ago. The one full of inconsistencies, minor typos, and a glaringly optimistic, almost delusional projection for the next quarter that wasn't supported by the raw data. It was the version she had prepared before her deep dive, the one she knew was flawed. A slow, deliberate calm settled over her. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of his office without another word. As she passed her desk, she picked up the flawed report. With practiced ease, she walked back into Mr. Harrison's office. He was still admiring his reflection in the window. Silently, she swapped the folders. She took her masterpiece, her perfectly polished report, and left him with the time bomb. "You're right, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice even and steady. "My mistake." He waved a dismissive hand, not even turning around. "Just make sure my coffee is hot for the meeting, Amelia. That's a good girl." As she walked back to her desk, clutching the correct report to her chest like a shield, a single thought echoed in her mind. He laughed and called her decoration. Now he would see what happened when the decoration was removed, leaving only the unvarnished, ugly truth for the world to see. The boardroom at Sterling Corp was a modern coliseum, a theater of power designed for gladiatorial combat disguised as corporate strategy. A single, colossal slab of polished obsidian served as the meeting table, so dark and reflective it seemed to hold the anxious faces of the board members captive on its surface. At its head sat Ms. Sterling, the CEO, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by her impeccably sharp pantsuits. Her presence commanded a silence that was both respectful and tinged with fear. Today, the air was particularly thick with anticipation. The merger was everything, and Mr. B. Harrison's report was the scripture from which they would all preach. Amelia stood by the side wall, a ghost in a navy blue dress, ostensibly there to manage the presentation slides and pour water. In reality, she was a spectator at the public execution she had single-handedly orchestrated. She kept her expression meticulously neutral, a mask of professional deference she had perfected over 5 years. Inside, however, her heart was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of rebellion. She focused on the quiet hum of the air conditioning, a sound she'd once found maddeningly monotonous but now embraced as a cloak for her own roaring thoughts. Mr. Harrison began his presentation. He strode to the front of the room, radiating a confidence so profound it was almost a physical force. He was a performer, and this was his opening night. He launched into the report summary, his voice booming with practiced authority. He spoke of synergies and paradigm shifts, buzzwords that Amelia herself had peppered into the real report to make it more palatable. Here, in this flawed version, they were just empty armor, glittering but hollow. For the first 10 minutes, the illusion held. The board members nodded along, their initial anxieties soothed by his confident delivery. Mr. Harrison, basking in their focused attention, shot a triumphant, patronizing glance toward Amelia. See? This is how it's done. She simply returned a blank stare, her unnatural calmness seeming to unnerve him for a fraction of a second before he turned back to his audience. Then the first crack appeared. Mr. Henderson, the CFO, a man who saw the world not in colors but in balance sheets, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Robert?" he interrupted, his voice a dry rasp that cut through the smooth presentation. "Could you go back to the slide on projected revenue? There seems to be a significant discrepancy. You're forecasting a 30% increase in Q4, but the underlying data from Q3 shows a considerable market downturn. How do you reconcile that leap?" Mr. Harrison faltered, the smooth cadence of his speech breaking for the first time. He glanced at the screen, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. He hadn't read the report, Amelia knew. He'd only memorized the executive summary she'd written for the flawed version. He cleared his throat. "An excellent question, John. It's an aggressive projection, I admit, but it's based on the anticipated market recovery and the strategic initiatives we have in place." He was bluffing, and it was painfully obvious. Amelia could see Ms. Sterling knew it. The CEO's eyes, like a hawk's, were fixed on him. "Which strategic initiatives, Robert?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying the lethal precision of a stiletto. "I'm looking at page 17 of the distributed report. The initiatives detailed here seem to be standard operational adjustments. They don't support a 30% jump. In fact, based on the risk analysis on page 22, they barely support a 5% increase." Mr. Harrison began to sweat. A single bead traced a path down his temple. He fumbled with his notes, the silver pen now tapping a frantic, desperate rhythm against the lectern. The risk analysis. Yes, that section. As I mentioned to Amelia when she was compiling it, her analysis was a bit pessimistic. "So, this isn't your analysis?" Ms. Sterling pressed, leaning forward. "This is your assistance?" "No, of course not. I mean, I guided her," he stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre and gaining a note of defensive panic. "She simply compiled the data. There must be a typo, a miscalculation in the final print." Another board member, the head of marketing, chimed in, smelling blood in the water. "The inconsistencies aren't just on that slide, Robert. The customer acquisition cost is listed as decreasing by 15%, but the marketing spend on page 30 is projected to triple. How does that math work?" The room was turning on him. The faces that had been nodding in approval were now masks of skepticism and undisguised concern. He was exposed, a captain sinking with a ship he didn't know how to sail. Panicked, he did what he always did when cornered. He looked for someone to blame. His eyes, wide and desperate, darted to Amelia. "There's been a mistake," he announced, his voice suddenly loud, an octave too high. "A grave error. Amelia, you must have given me the wrong draft. I had a corrected version. This is completely unacceptable." He turned to the board, spreading his hands in a gesture of shared victimhood. My sincerest apologies. My assistant, it seems, is not as competent as I was led to believe. She has handed me a preliminary, deeply flawed draft. It's a simple yet catastrophic clerical error. All eyes in the room swiveled to Amelia. The weight of their collective gaze was immense, a physical pressure. For a fleeting moment, the old, timid Amelia wanted to shrink, to apologize, to absorb the blame as she had so many times before. But then she remembered the sting of his words, spoken with such casual cruelty just yesterday. Decorative. The memory was a spine of steel. She met Miss Sterling's gaze directly. Her expression was calm, her voice clear and unwavering, cutting through his panicked blustering. That is not true, Mr. Harrison. You and I both know that is the version of the report I placed on your desk yesterday afternoon, the one you approved without reading. Ms. Sterling raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She looked from her panicked, sweating vice president to the composed, unshakable administrative assistant. She had run Sterling Corp for 20 years. She knew incompetence and deception when she saw them. Amelia, Mrs. Sterling said, her tone leaving no doubt as to who she believed. Do you have another version of this report? This was the moment. The culmination of 5 years of silent frustration, of swallowed pride, of unacknowledged brilliance. Amelia walked to the small credenza where she had placed her bag. Every eye followed her. With a deliberate, unhurried grace, she retrieved the second blue folder, her masterpiece. Yes, Mrs. Sterling, I do, she said, her voice resonating with a newfound authority that filled the tense silence. She walked back to the table and placed the folder before the CEO. I have the correct and thoroughly vetted report right here, the one based on the actual data, the one Mr. Harrison called adequate and refused to review. She stepped back. Ms. Sterling opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page, then the executive summary. A long, telling silence stretched across the room, broken only by Mr. Harrison's ragged breathing. He stood frozen by the lectern, his face pale, the confident smirk finally, utterly erased. He looked at Amelia, and for the very first time, he didn't see a decorative object. He saw the architect of his demise. Ms. Sterling looked up from the folder, her gaze sharp and decisive. She looked past the disgraced Mr. Harrison, her eyes landing squarely on Amelia. Amelia, she said, her voice crisp and clear. Please, walk us through it. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The air in the boardroom, already thick with tension, became electric. Mr. Harrison looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth opening and closing silently, no sound emerging. The board members exchanged glances, a mixture of shock and intrigue on their faces. An administrative assistant being asked to lead a board-level presentation on a multi-billion-dollar merger? It was unheard of. Amelia felt a tremor of fear, a final fleeting echo of the woman she had been just 24 hours ago. Her hands were cold, her stomach a knot of nerves. Then she looked at the report in Ms. Sterling's hands. Her report. She thought of the 5 years she had spent in the shadows, her intellect and ambition dismissed, her contributions absorbed and claimed by the man now standing frozen in his expensive, ill-fitting suit of lies. The fear dissolved, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Of course, Mrs. Sterling, Amelia said. She walked to the front of the room, her steps measured and sure. She did not take the lectern. That was Harrison's stage. Instead, she stood to the side of the main screen, commanding the room from a different position of power. She clicked the remote, and the flawed, garish slide of a 30% revenue projection vanished, replaced by a clean, sober chart showing a realistic, hard-won 7% growth. My apologies for the confusion of the previous presentation, Amelia began, her voice steady and clear. It didn't carry the booming artificial confidence of Harrison, but it had something far more compelling: authenticity. The version you were shown was a preliminary draft, one that contained several overly optimistic assumptions that were not borne out by a deeper analysis of the data. The reality of our position is more challenging, but also, I believe, more promising if we approach it with clarity. She didn't just present the numbers. She told their story. She spoke of market trends not as abstract concepts, but as shifting tides they could navigate. She explained the complex interplay between marketing spend and customer acquisition, with a lucidity that made it seem simple. She wasn't just repeating facts she had compiled. She was demonstrating an intuitive understanding of the business itself. She had lived in the data for weeks, and she knew its every secret. Mr. Henderson, the CFO, listened with rapt attention, nodding slowly. Your risk analysis on page 22, he said, looking at her directly. You've identified a potential supply chain disruption in the Asian market that no one else has flagged. Where did that insight come from? Before Amelia could answer, Mr. Harrison, finally jolted back to life by the sheer audacity of it all, stepped forward. "I identified that risk," he snapped, his voice shrill. "She is simply reading my notes. This is my work. She has stolen my work." The room fell silent. "Ms." Sterling turned her head slowly, fixing Mr. Harrison with a gaze so cold it could have frozen lava. "Robert," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "Sit down. Do not speak again unless spoken to." The command was absolute. Humiliated, his face a mask of purple rage, Mr. Harrison stumbled back to his chair. He was no longer a participant. He was a prisoner, forced to watch his own public dismantling. Amelia continued as if he had never spoken. "To answer your question, Mr. Henderson, that insight came from cross-referencing shipping manifests from 3 of our key suppliers, with regional economic forecasts and political news out of the area. There were minor delays reported over the last 6 weeks, small enough to be dismissed as operational friction. But when you map them against the rising political tensions, a pattern emerges. It suggests a higher probability of a significant disruption within the next 6 months. The report details a mitigation strategy on page 34. She was no longer Amelia, the administrative assistant. She was a strategist. She was a leader. The board members saw it. They started asking her questions directly, their tone shifting from skeptical to deferential. They leaned in when she spoke. They were not just listening to a presentation. They were receiving counsel. For the next hour, Amelia commanded the room. She took them through every slide of her masterpiece, her confidence growing with every question she answered flawlessly. She articulated the nuances of the merger with an eloquence that Harrison, with all his bluster, could never have achieved. She pointed out not just the risks he had missed, but the opportunities, subtle, strategic openings that were only visible to someone who had done the real work. Finally, she arrived at the last slide, a simple, elegant summary of her key recommendations. The room was silent, the board members looking at the screen, then at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and dawning realization. They had come into this room to evaluate a report from their VP of operations. They had, instead, discovered a diamond. The meeting concluded. Mrs. Sterling stood up. "Thank you, Amelia," she said. It was all she said to her, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. It was a look of profound, unadulterated respect. Then, Ms. Sterling turned her attention to the man still sitting silently in his chair, a man who seemed to have shrunk in his suit. "Robert," she said, and the boardroom temperature dropped another 20 degrees. "I believe we have heard everything we need to from you. Your services are no longer required at Sterling Corp. Please have your desk cleared out by the end of the day. Security will escort you." There was a collective, sharp intake of breath around the table. It was brutal. It was final. "Mr." Harrison stared at her, then at Amelia, his face a canvas of disbelief and hatred. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to beg, but no words came out. He was a ghost already, haunting the scene of his own professional death. Amelia gathered her notepad and the remote control. She didn't look at Harrison. With quiet dignity, she walked towards the door, the eyes of every board member following her. As she stepped out of the Coliseum and into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, she felt a dizzying, terrifying, exhilarating sense of freedom. The invisible woman was finally, irrevocably, gone. The hallway outside the boardroom felt like a different universe. The muted sounds of the office, the distant ringing of a phone, the soft whir of the ventilation system, rushed in to fill the void left by the intense, pressurized silence of the meeting. Amelia leaned against the cool wall, her legs suddenly feeling unsteady. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the past hour began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its wake. She had done it. She had actually done it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the reality of what had just transpired wash over her. She had not only exposed Harrison, she had effectively ended his career. She had spoken truth to power, and in a shocking twist she never could have predicted, power had listened. The boardroom door opened. Amelia straightened up, expecting to see one of the board members. Instead, it was Mr. Harrison, flanked by 2 stoic security guards. His face was ashen, his eyes hollowed out with shock and rage. All the arrogance, all the smug superiority had been stripped away, leaving behind the pathetic, withered core of a small and deeply insecure man. His gaze fell upon her, and for a second, a flicker of his old venomous self returned. "You," he hissed, his voice a ragged whisper. "You did this, you little nobody." Amelia looked at him, not with pity, not with triumph, but with a strange sense of detachment. He was no longer her boss, no longer her tormentor. He was just a man who had made his own choices, a man who had built his career on the stolen work of others, and was now facing the inevitable collapse of that fragile foundation. She didn't answer him. She simply held his gaze, her silence a more powerful response than any words she could have uttered. There was nothing left to say. Defeated, he turned and allowed the guards to lead him away, a disgraced king being marched from his conquered castle. Amelia watched him go, a ghost disappearing down the long corridor until he was gone. She walked back towards the executive suite, the path she had walked 1,000 times before. But this time, everything was different. Heads popped up over cubicle walls. Conversations quieted as she passed. The whispers followed her like a ripple in a pond. They were whispers not of gossip, but of awe. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had slain the dragon. When she reached her desk, the small, neat space that had been her entire world, it felt alien to her. The tidy stack of papers, the sensible mug, the photo of a beach she dreamed of visiting, it all belonged to a different person, a different life. She sank into her chair, her mind a whirlwind. What now? She had won the battle, but what did that mean for her future? Was she still just an administrative assistant? One who had committed an act of spectacular, career-defining insubordination? Her internal questions were answered by the quiet buzz of her desk phone. The display read, CEO's office. Hello? She answered, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Amelia, it's Eleanor Sterling, said the crisp, unmistakable voice. Could you come to my office, please? Taking a deep breath, Amelia walked the short distance to the CEO's office, the one corner of the company she had only ever seen from the outside. Ms. Sterling, Eleanor, was standing by the window, the same window from which Harrison had so arrogantly surveyed his kingdom just the day before. She turned as Amelia entered, a small, thoughtful smile on her face. Please sit down, she said, gesturing to one of the plush leather chairs opposite her desk. The office was elegant, understated, and radiated a quiet, formidable power. It was nothing like Harrison's ostentatious mahogany tomb. Amelia, Ms. Sterling began once she had seated herself, I want to apologize. It is my responsibility to know the capabilities of my team, and it's clear I have been blind to one of my greatest assets. What I saw today was not just competence. It was brilliance. And it was courage. Amelia felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Thank you, Ms. Sterling. Eleanor, please. I think we are past the point of formality, she said. The board was impressed. That is a colossal understatement. They were stunned. You didn't just save the merger, you made it stronger. The mitigation strategies you proposed, the opportunities you identified, that's not the work of an assistant. That's the work of a leader. She paused, her gaze direct and searching. Robert's former position, Vice President of Operations, is now vacant. It is a demanding role. It requires vision, integrity, and an almost fanatical attention to detail. It requires someone the board can trust implicitly. It requires someone like you. Amelia's breath hitched. She stared at Eleanor, speechless. Vice President? It was a leap so vast, so impossibly grand that she couldn't process it. I understand this is sudden, Eleanor continued gently, and I know you don't have the traditional background for such a role, but I have learned today that tradition is not nearly as valuable as talent. I don't care about your title for the last 5 years. I care about what you can do for this company for the next 5 years. The job is yours, if you want it. Did she want it? A part of her, the ghost of the timid woman she had been, screamed that it was too much, that she wasn't ready. But another, stronger voice, the one she had discovered in that boardroom, spoke with absolute certainty. This was what she had worked for. This was what she had earned. Yes, Amelia said, the single word clear and strong. Yes, I want it. A genuine, warm smile broke across Eleanor Sterling's face. Excellent. Welcome to the team, Amelia. 2 weeks later, Amelia sat at a large, polished desk of her own. It was Robert Harrison's old office, but she had transformed it. The heavy, dark furniture was gone, replaced with clean lines and light wood. On the wall, instead of self-aggrandizing awards, hung detailed logistical maps and project timelines. The scent of stale coffee was gone, replaced by the faint, fresh smell of a potted orchid someone from her new team had given her. She looked out the window at the bustling city below. It was the same view Harrison had so admired, but she saw it differently. She didn't see a kingdom to be ruled. She saw a complex, interconnected system, a world of challenges and opportunities. She was no longer an invisible cog in the machine. She was one of its chief architects. Her phone buzzed. It was Eleanor. "Ready for the merger kickoff meeting?" the text read. Amelia smiled. She picked up her tablet, which held the presentation she had built herself, every slide, every number a testament to her own work. As she walked towards the boardroom, she caught her reflection in the glass. She saw a woman who looked confident, capable, and finally, visible. She had learned the hard way that hard work didn't always speak for itself. Sometimes you had to give it a voice. And her voice, she now knew, was one that could command the room.